morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is the 14th meeting of the Bitcoin Cash developers for the year 2019. And we're about to start with introductions, and then I'll quickly run through our agenda prior to starting. So on my top left, I have David from Coindance. David, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi guys, I'm David Klakurka from Blockchain Ventures. We've got a number of projects going in the space. Recently, I've been mostly focused on keeping the community up to date on protocol and platform development taking place in Bitcoin Cash.
Great, thank you, David. Moving over to my next window is Antony Zegers.
Oh, hi, I'm Antony, known as Mangari, and also online. Yeah, I work mostly on Bitcoin ABC.
Thank you, Thank you, Antony. And next is Mark Lundeberg.
Hi, I'm Mark Lundeberg. I'm a Bitcoin Cash developer, and recently, I guess most relevant to this meeting, I was working on the recent consensus upgrade, so the November one that's upcoming and the May one that we had the last upgrade.
Great, thank you, Mark. Next is Fernando.
Hello, I am Fernando Pelliccioni. I am working on BitPrim node.
Thank you, Fernando. And next, Jason B. Cox.
Hi, I'm Jason Cox, a software engineer contributing to Bitcoin ABC.
Thanks, Jason. Next is another Jason, Jason Dreyzehner.
It's Jason Dreyzehner.
Dreyzehner, sorry.
And I am working on BitAuth, bitauth.com. It's bitauth.com, which is a secure login for websites using Bitcoin Cash.
Great, of course. Thank you, Jason. Next in the next box is Josh Green from Bitcoin Verde.
Hi, Josh Green, lead developer of Bitcoin Verde and also CEO of Software Verde.
Great, thank you, Josh. From far away, Andrea Suisani.
Hello, everybody. I'm Andrea Suisani, as known as SigPig, Bitcoin Unlimited developer.
Great, thank you, Andrea. And next we have Tyler Smith.
Hi, I'm Tyler. Also go by Tcrypt online. I'm an Open Bazaar developer, and in my side time, I like to do a lot of experiments with Bitcoin and working on Bitcoin libraries. Lately, I've been working a lot with BCHD.
Great. We know about BCHD, which leads right into Chris Pacia.
Yep, I'm Chris. Also work with Tyler at Open Bazaar, and I maintain BCHD.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to quickly go through an overview of the agenda. I put it up, I'll repost it again, but I'll just run through it quickly with you now. Items on the agenda include Avalanche, payment protocol BIP70. There'll be a discussion about that. Where we'll have a discussion about the upgrade coming on November 15th. And then we will throw it open to attendees to ask questions and ask the panelists if they have any additional topics to raise. So that's basically the agenda in a nutshell. But let's start with the first item on the agenda, which is Avalanche. Antony, do you want to do a quick intro to this?
Well, maybe I don't think I'm the best guy to do that necessarily. Maybe Tyler or someone can do it.
That's exactly the intro that I was looking for, that you could introduce Tyler.
Yeah. I know Tyler's been working on experimenting around with it, so
right.
That's about all I know.
Okay. Tyler.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that Omri couldn't be here today because he definitely knows a lot more about this than I do. But yeah, I've been working on Avalanche pre and post consensus lately. Previously, we had a BCHD example of pre-consensus where you could watch transactions get pre-confirmed in real time. So the idea is that we can have a network of people participating in this really fast consensus. So as new transactions and blocks come in, they can quickly decide between conflict sets, like if there's a double spend or if there's a block race. And then miners later will essentially notarize that into blocks using the standard Nakamoto consensus. So what I've been working on the past couple months is taking the pre-consensus demonstration that we had, adding post-consensus, which works on blocks instead of transactions. And I've also been changing, before pretty much it was pretty much anybody could join it. There was no Sybil prevention mechanism, which is one of the big outstanding questions with Avalanche. How are we going to do Sybil protection? So I've been experimenting with a proof of stake system that will let anybody with a few coins stake and participate in the pre-consensus. And I'm hoping to have like a light version of that up in the next month or two that won't actually, miners won't enforce it. They won't orphan blocks that deviate, but it will log out when finalizations happen or rejections happen. And I'm also experimenting with some in-between modes between just logging what happens and miner enforcement. For example, I think miners may be able to use it to resolve block races at the tip, for example, which doesn't affect any other nodes, but it does mean that, like in the case of a block race, miners should more rapidly converge to one side than the other. Yeah, so that's pretty much where I'm at. There's just a lot of playing around with how things could work. There's really just a lot of open-ended questions, so there's a lot of different avenues to explore and see how things might work. But hopefully I'll have a proof of concept up that anybody can participate in and join here in the next couple of months.
Great, thank you, Tyler. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Tyler about Avalanche?
I guess I'll ask a question. So I guess like the way I imagine it is, like right now, if there's two blocks that are in a race at the same height, the node just goes by whichever's first seen, I guess. And so I guess that in that context, it makes sense that Avalanche would allow them to, which is not a very good consensus mechanism. So in that case, it seems like Avalanche is a definite improvement where everyone could say, okay, we're going to build on this tip. And then you're not, like that makes sense for miners to not risk being orphaned. Is that correct? And then I guess my other question is, would it also apply to finalization? Is that's a separate thing, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So eventually, what would be ideal is if a block comes in, it gets confirmed by Avalanche, and then the rest of the miners will sort of fight to ensure that that block ends up in the main chain. So if it sees a longer chain that has a block that's been rejected by Avalanche, it would keep working on the Avalanche chain for as long as they think it makes sense for them to do, to try to fight and make that chain longest again. Those kinds of proposals for implementing post-consensus seem to be at least somewhat contentious. So I've been kind of looking for things we can do kind of in between a system that just logs stuff and doesn't do anything, and a system that has full-blown miner enforced Avalanche. So the thing about resolving blocks at the tip, what you said is exactly right. Normally, it's just based on whichever one is seen first. So I think using Avalanche to resolve that seems like a way that we can demonstrate and test out this idea without a contentious, having miners fight to keep that block in the longest chain. That's kind of my idea there, if that makes sense. And yeah, that'd be separate from finalization, which is the miners do fight to keep that block in the chain. In this case, they would use it to resolve the block at the tip, and then if Avalanche says mine on block A, but then the chain with block B comes out one block ahead, then it just go ahead and give up and go with block B for now. And I think I imagine people would be more willing to try that out and to see how that works than to go, jump straight into full-blown post-consensus, but we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, it's pretty much analogous to what happens now. Like if two blocks are in a race at the same height, then if you're mining on the one that you saw first, but then everyone else saw another one first, you'll just give up as soon as you see a block built on the other one.
Yeah, exactly. The only difference is instead of mining on the block you saw first, once Avalanche picks a block, you start mining on that block instead. But you don't fight for it. You give up if it loses, just for that little bit of time.
So the only potential incentive compatibility difference might be what the Sybil mechanism is. And I think you said staking coins.
That's what I'm looking into right now. Yeah.
Nice. So I'd love to. Hopefully you'll get to write a little bit more about it so I can read it through. I'm thinking about. Right now the Sybil mechanism, of course, is or the Sybil mechanism I had heard of before was the past 100 miners or 1,000 miners or something. But if it's staking coins, then I think that changes the dynamics a little bit from 51% of miners, I guess. Are there any, has anybody thought that through and written it down somewhere?
Written it down, not so much. I've had conversations with Omri and others about this, and that there was quite a few concerns about you doing the last n blocks because it would be conceptually trivial for a large miner to mine a bunch of blocks and then decide, oh, we don't actually want the other miners to mine, and then essentially you can exclude everyone else and it becomes a complete disaster. And there's you can't make n big enough that you're really confident that it won't happen at some time in the future without making n ridiculously large. I think coinage in conjunction with staking makes sense because people that have stake in the network, they don't want to see Avalanche be twisted into ruining the value of the coins that they're holding. So I think the incentives align there.
Yeah. The only thing I'd add maybe is that we're trading variance, we're trading some mining variance there for the ability for larger stakers to maybe get lower variance than smaller stakers, I would say. So that's something we should think about. But yeah, it'd be interesting to write that out and figure that out on paper.
Yeah, possibly. But one thing to keep in mind is miners are not always the largest stakers. So very often you have the exchanges are holding on to a vast majority of the coins. And this is actually a good thing because the exchanges, they want lower variance. They want some predictability for their business. So that actually facilitates trade and has some nice properties. So
yeah,
I'm confident in it.
Cool. Yeah, it'd be awesome if you could put that down on paper. 5-minute 5-minute read.
I'll look into it. I've been a little busy lately. But I guess we'll see.
Take your time. No rush.
Any further discussion on Avalanche?
Yeah, I guess I have one question for Tyler. Another question. I know that in the Avalanche paper, the way that you vote, I think the way you vote, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the way you vote is you have one thing, and then if you reject that, then you have to have another thing to replace it. So a transaction, say, or a conflicting transaction. So with the chain tip, if you have two chain tips, I can see that you could use that type of voting because you could reject one chain tip only if you had another chain tip to replace it with.
Yeah,
But
exactly. There has to be another item in the conflict set for you to reject an item. Yep.
So in your implementation, do you always have to have another item, or because there was also talk about changing it to vote where you can just reject, have like a yes no vote or like yes no pass or something.
Yeah, so in my system, you can only reject something if something else in the conflict set has been approved or has been finalized. So you can't just, if you just get a transaction and it's not a double spend or anything, you can't say, oh, we reject this transaction. You can finalize it, or you could just not vote on it, I guess, if you want. Only when there's a double spend and one side of the double spend has been finalized is the other transaction marked rejected.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's closer to the original Avalanche paper, or is the original paper. I guess the only issue with that, at least as it relates to regular transactions, is that would allow any transaction, regardless of like how small of a fee it paid, to be finalized. So you might be opening up to like a DDoS there. So we'd have to think about ways around that issue.
Yeah, I mean, if we go with the version where miners don't have to include finalized transactions as long as they don't include conflicting transactions, then you could finalize a transaction with a small fee. Miners just might not mine it. But then you can't, I mean, you can't replace by fee or anything, which I know we don't really want to do anyways, so that's, I guess, a benefit. But
yeah. There is like still mempool concerns there too, like
that's true.
you have
Yeah,
to
I see.
keep track of which transactions you finalized.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, I see Josh Green has his hand up. Did you want to comment, Josh?
Yeah, thanks. Can you see me? Actually, I don't know if my video's working. But...
Yep,
I can.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this is the first. I mean, I'd heard of Avalanche obviously a few times. I know we talked about it in Australia. This is the first I've heard us considering Avalanche for what you're calling post-consensus, so like consensus of blocks, which is interesting, and I definitely haven't formed an opinion on that. That being said, I'm actually just really curious about like, are we putting? I am proposing the question: is it a good idea to try to solve this problem? Like, if I go through like the number of basically like race blocks or like orphaned blocks, it's like 1 every 10,000 blocks if we're lucky. So I'm not really sure if we're solving like a problem that happens that often. And if we're going to be adding a lot of complexity to what are essentially consensus rules, I feel like it should be kind of really important that we solve it. I don't think this necessarily translates to Avalanche at the transaction level, because that I think is a pretty strong use case. I think SPV security is pretty lacking as it is anyway. So anything that we can add there, I think, doesn't really have a strong argument against it. But I think Nakamoto consensus has been pretty strong for like 10 years now. So I think there has to be a pretty strong ask for us to really be investing a lot of time and money and basically risk. So that's all. I just want to kind of propose that concept. If anyone's ever like try to back that up with some statistics or anything like that.
Yeah.
That's all.
No, that's a good point. I want to be clear that the using Avalanche to solve block races at the tip was just an idea I had to experiment and prove out the technology, I guess. The bigger motivation would be to prevent mining attacks, short and medium term 51% attacks, for example. So something like post-consensus could replace the 10 block reorg limit that ABC has, for example. So the idea is not, eventually if the promise of Avalanche bears out, it would not just be used to resolve block races at the tip, it would be used to finalize blocks when they come in, so miners could organize to basically fight against a 51% attacker by making the Avalanche chain stay the longest chain long term. It's kind of the idea. So I totally get what you mean about if it was just for block races at the tip, this would be like way overkill. That's just kind of my idea of a way to test it out. But I think that the promise is definitely has a lot more potential than just that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid retort, and I think that's. I mean, I would love to see that kind of rationale explained going forward too, just so that we're.
Yeah, Josh, I don't know if you were around, but there was more discussion on this around the time of the BSV fork when we were under attack from Craig. That it was like looking for ways to strengthen 51, against 51% attacks in a better way. Now, it's also, kind of important to point out too that we still have like a severe minority hash related to BTC. And I don't know if we're in a healthy position. I don't think we're in a particularly healthy position long term with this minority hash. So it's it's kind of like at some point something needs to change. Either we need to flip BTC, and so we get the majority hash, change the algorithm so we're not using the same one as them, or explore options like this, where with post consensus. I'm not sure, if this is the best way of going about it or not, but that's the basic idea there. It's to try and strengthen the harden against the 51% attacks.
So one thing I do want to point out is, although hardening against 51% attacks is a nice potential for Avalanche, it's not actually the primary goal. Avalanche actually has a lot of nice properties that allow us to scale Bitcoin Cash, and that's primarily what ABC is striving for, at least. Because with pre-consensus, we're opening up a lot of doors for being able to increase the order of magnitude, many orders of magnitude more transactions and throughput. Because Omri had a really good way of putting this. Essentially, you have a flurry of activity whenever the nodes get a block, and that flurry of activity is essentially the limiting factor for how many transactions you can push through a node. If we're able to spread out that activity across the entire average 10-minute interval, then our throughput can be as good as any other data center machine. Because Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, they're pushing millions of transactions, or not transactions, but requests per minute. And that's something that Bitcoin Cash, in theory, should be able to do. And Avalanche allows us to do that with some degree of certainty. So it's really the certainty factor that's getting fixed. So it opens up a lot of those doors, and I don't want to lose sight of that, because that for me is the most important thing about Avalanche. And now what makes Avalanche so interesting is it not only allows us to increase the throughput in the node, it also allows us to do other things like protect against 51% attacks. It allows us to do pre-consensus, post-consensus. The fact that it does all of these things fairly well all at the same time is a really good indicator that we're onto something. It just shows us that Avalanche is a really good technology, and that implementing it into BCH will have a lot of positive side effects. That's why we're focused so much on it right now, and I know Omri is kind of laying the groundwork for being able to have a very high performance Avalanche implementation on ABC. That's why he's so interested in the Quick protocol. So I'm really looking forward to that, because it's even though the 51% attack is on everyone's minds considering recent history, there's a lot more to it than that.
Thanks, Jason. Any further comments or discussion on Avalanche?
Yeah, I had one question. How well does it play with things like Xthin, compact blocks, and graphene?
Don't all jump at once.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't have a great answer for you there. I haven't looked into those a whole bunch. Those are, I mean, anything that's like a block compression protocol, I don't think it's going to play super well with, because for at least for pre-consensus, you need to be propagating the transactions all the time, not just batch them into a block and send them out. They need to be sent out individually. So for those specifically, I'm not sure. I know Chris mentioned an idea about potentially using Avalanche on weak blocks. So there may be some plan with like weak blocks or storm, but I need to look into that more and think through that more. But so, you know, it might fit with some of the ideas, but I think a lot of them, it's fairly orthogonal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually thinking out loud, it might actually help compact blocks quite a bit, because if all the nodes are constantly communicating about what transactions they plan on finalizing, then your mem pool will be much more consistent. So that when a block comes, your compact block is very small. You already have all the transactions in your mem pool. I think it'll actually be positive.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jason. That's actually, like, thinking out loud too. That's exactly what I was thinking. It's basically a really good way for the nodes to know ahead of time if their mempool is in sync, right? Mm-hmm. And obviously the only thing that's really expensive about like the block compression algorithms is kind of that second round of like, oh, I don't have this transaction, so I have to go request it. And each time, you know, each round you do, it becomes increasingly less efficient. So if the nodes are more confident that their mempool is synced, then yeah, I think that would definitely play very nicely.
One's related final note. I think it'd be really valuable to pick a different name for post-consensus stuff than Avalanche. Even if we use the same consensus mechanism for it, Avalanche is a really good name for the transaction pre-consensus protocol, but it doesn't even really describe the post-consensus stuff. So it might be a good idea to pick a new name for the consensus part and use it for both, or just use Avalanche for the transaction stuff and not burden it with post-consensus stuff.
I also really agree. And actually, the thing that kind of struck me initially is hearing about the post-consensus stuff. Like, that could very easily be pretty contentious among the community. Like, and I think Avalanche is kind of cool, but I would really hate to see it be you know, looked down on because people don't agree with the post-consensus stuff. And I think it very well could be a separate conversation. So yeah, I think calling it something different and even just kind of like publicizing it after Avalanche, you know, is a thing might be even a better idea too. So
I also like this idea. It helps clarify the conversation when people are talking about it, because, you know, people bring up Avalanche and everyone in the room is thinking of a completely different concept. Right. So giving particular names to each feature that is planning to be built on top of Avalanche, I think would be a good idea.
Yeah, I've just been calling my system Snow Globe for now so that it doesn't get confused with Avalanche. It uses Avalanche for the different things, but it's kind of an experimental system. I don't want any failures or problems or whatever with my system to bring down the Avalanche name.
Nice. Yeah, Avalanche is the consensus mechanism to make resolving transactions a lot more smooth, so we can get database writes as fast as normal databases.
And as we get closer to Christmas, Snow Globe is somewhat appropriate, so that's great. Is there any further discussion on Avalanche at this point? Mark, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I'm not sure why post-consensus Avalanche, let's call it, I'm not sure why that would be more contentious than the pre-consensus one, because my understanding is pre-consensus one would also involve orphaning blocks that are valid, even if they're the first seen block, because they contain a transaction that you don't like or something like this. So that's also going away from Nakamoto consensus. So I don't, from my perspective, the pre-consensus Avalanche is a much more complicated mechanism, but it builds on top of the post-consensus work, because for the pre-consensus Avalanche to actually have any teeth, it needs to orphan blocks that contain the transactions that it didn't like, even though those blocks are totally valid. So,
but it doesn't need to orphan blocks that have more, it doesn't need to orphan chains that have more work.
Right.
So that's, that would be where I'd say it differs significantly.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you either, Mark. Like, I think the equal parts can be very contentious. I just think that it's mostly a branding issue, right? Like, it's going to be perception, and you know, I think keeping them separate is probably just a safer bet, just to keep people's, as people come up to speed with like their opinions, I think it might be better. It's just what I have no facts to back it up. It's just what I think might be true.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm also curious about the proof of stake thing. Like, you know, I've only been in the Bitcoin space a short time, so I've only really looked at proof of work coin, you know, Bitcoin, and but I know there's been a lot of work on proof of stake systems, and there's all sorts of subtleties, variations, different kinds of attacks. So I'd be really curious to see like what is the proof of stake system that's intended here? What are the weaknesses? Looking at past proof of stake blockchains, because I don't know the history, and I'm sure there's a very rich history to draw on there. So I'd be very curious to see some sort of like intro that's explaining why the proof of stake was chosen in a certain way for Avalanche on Bitcoin Cash. So yeah, if anyone's a proof of stake expert, I would love to hear that.
Sounds like we might have some homework for the next meeting. Thank you, guys. I think we'll move on now to payment protocol BIP70 discussion. There's recently been discussion in the community about BIP70 specification and associated issues. I wonder if Antony could give us an introduction to this topic.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to raise this because there's been a bunch of different discussions happening around it. I guess just to explain for anyone watching or whatever who doesn't know exactly what this is, like everyone's familiar with, like, you know, an address which is Bitcoin Cash :Q blah 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 blah, you know, and then there's a thing called BIP21 which builds on that, which is essentially you can add a bunch of information to it, like an amount or whatever. So you can click on a link and it'll pop up in your wallet with the amount already in there, or you know, you scan your QR code. And then BIP70 is another. It was made, I guess, in around 2013, I think, by Gavin Andresen and Mike Hearn, and it basically just adds even more stuff to that. But it's a bit of a different system. Like, it will basically establish a connection with the merchant. And it basically adds other stuff, like you can have, like, it's authenticated for one thing, and it allows just more information to be exchanged basically when you pay someone. So you can have more than one output, which Ben Armani has been talking about a lot. So I guess it's just come up in a number of forums recently. I've noticed it, I guess, a lot in Electron Cash community, like developers have been talking about it because the Electron Cash software can produce BIP70 invoices. And I think there was, like, basically people who are trying to build it off of the spec that's on, you know, it's on the Bitcoin GitHub, have noticed a bunch of inconsistencies, I guess, with how it's actually implemented and how the specification's written, or at least things that aren't clear. So it kind of made me think maybe we should at least look into updating the specification so that it's more useful for people. And yeah, and I guess there was various details in it. I was hoping, I guess Jason is here, you were at BitPay, but I was hoping there would be other, like, BitPay people to, because I know BitPay is a big proponent of BIP70. So yeah, I don't know, I guess I just feel like it's something that the Bitcoin Cash community seems to be kind of gravitating towards using BIP70 as a first class kind of. Yeah,
standardizing it, better standardizing it, I think would be an awesome idea, specifically for the Bitcoin Cash space. And it's not something I haven't thought about. Maybe I mean, it's been 6 months or a year, but I can give some of the basic background. Sure. Yeah, so implementing BIP70 has always been kind of a pain. There are a few oddities about it. One oddity is the packaging format for messages in the system is protobuf. So if your wallet app is not using protobufs already, then implementing BIP70 means you have to implement a binary protocol, which is very messy if you're building like a JavaScript app or something. I mean, even if you're building something in Swift, a lot of people are using JSON APIs to communicate with the backend. So it adds quite a bit of infrastructure you just need to add to your project there. And then maybe the worst part is X509 support, which means you have to implement like everything in the kitchen sink that is implemented by browsers in order to show the lock icon in a browser next to a web URL. And it's really nice in a wallet to be able to know definitively that the request was signed by the SSL certificate that you know is bitpay.com or coinbase.com or whatever. So that has upsides and downsides. But in general, the X509 support, I mean, I know in the JavaScript implementation, it's like 10,000 lines of code, and you have to import that plus, that includes a bunch of root certs that you need to like statically compile with your app and things. It just adds a very messy part to the protocol. So the reason also, and I'm no longer at BitPay, but I can describe a little bit more about like one of the biggest issues that payment processors in general have are when you get big enough, you have lots and lots of users that mess up a transaction just slightly. Because Bitcoin is a push system, you have to have these somewhat automated flows for people to get their money back if they accidentally sent too much or too little, or they sent it like 45 minutes late or 3 days late because transactions aren't moving on the network. And suddenly you have to have all sorts of exception circumstances. And you can't even give the user like an effective error message. Like for the user, it's like, what just happened? And 3 days later, they figure out, they're like, because we didn't even hear that they broadcasted the message in some circumstances. If their wallet sent like a really bad fee, it didn't even get broadcasted by intermediate nodes. And even if we're really well connected to the network, you might not even hear about it. So it becomes nearly impossible to provide interfaces where normal users who are not like super technical people that understand how Bitcoin works and understand how their wallet broadcasts messages and things like that. So, like if you're not a super technical person, it's not even possible to build an effective error message for you. And so BIP70 was basically the only way to stop the bleeding for those users specifically. And one of the issues with how it was originally set up is it was just BIP70's purpose was to try to do that security thing. In a lot of ways, in 2013, the reason everybody started implementing it was so that you could sign your Bitcoin address with an SSL certificate. That was kind of the primary purpose for getting into wallets. And it meant that when you showed a Bitcoin address on a website, what it really meant is that Tor users could effectively pay with Bitcoin because exit nodes wouldn't modify the Bitcoin address. And so there were lots of issues like that where people were getting man in the middle when you're broadcasting addresses. And there were lots of issues where we realized we needed SSL for a lot of it. And people were, and so the purpose of BIP70 when it was written was much more along that lines. But it turns out that it became much more effective in a way we didn't really expect in order to show those error messages for users if their wallet was messing up, basically. But the spec was designed so that the user would broadcast the payment before they sent the message to the merchant. And so the user would go ahead and send a payment that is going to trigger like a 3-day problem for the user. And they're going to get an email. It's going to tell them how to go back and copy and paste a receiving address into an interface, and it's going to take a little bit of time, and we'll automatically send it back to them. But if the user made a payment, and especially on the Bitcoin network, it was a $3 transaction or something like that, and their wallet subtracted the amount from the sending amount from the amount they're sending. Then, if they're making a $10 payment, they lose $3 when they broadcast it first. We'll be able to refund them $3 and they'll need to send another 13 in order to pay a $10 invoice. And so issues like that were just really, really nasty. So instead of broadcasting the message before, so instead of broadcasting the transaction before you tell the merchant directly about the transaction, we modified how a few of our apps and then a few wallet developers we talked to, we had them first send the transaction to BitPay, and if it would be accepted for payment, then then BitPay would broadcast it on the network. But if not, we can give an error message before the user has to run that circle. The primary issue with the primary development issue with making that transaction work that way, there are two actually. So the biggest one is when you broadcast a transaction, you create a transaction as a wallet. You need to mark in the wallet that you just spent that output, and you need to, take note that you just created a transaction which if it got broadcast to the network would give BitPay, in this example, would give BitPay your money. But if BitPay rejected it and said that, hey, you messed up, please, your wallet did something really crazy, please do something, do X, and we send an error message back. Now the wallet needs to properly handle the fact that it just in a sense handed an IOU to BitPay where BitPay could get that money if it wanted to. And so to handle that properly, it's very easy in the Bitcoin Cash system. You just move the money to another receiving address of the wallet. But in Bitcoin, you kind of have to, because transaction fees might not be negligible, you need to have perhaps non-automated ways of having a user choose how they want to handle the situation. Do they trust BitPay now for the rest of eternity with that $7 or whatever, or do they move that money to another receiving address in the wallet? And then I should also add there are a few other one other concern that was brought up by a few different wallets is, well, this means that BitPay can reject transactions if they don't have KYC and other things like that. And so this is the secret way that that the banks prevent Bitcoin from being used. And to that, I don't think that one's as important of a discussion because, I mean, quite frankly, all of the Bitcoin companies are, if they're operating in US jurisdiction and the American government prevents them from doing something, even if you push the transaction to them, it's not going to stop them from adhering to the law. Much better to fight that on the law side. What it means if you push the transaction to them and you've done something illegal, it just means they're not going to be able to give it back to you. So you don't want to stop the 70 stuff on KYC basis. Like if you have an anarcho-capitalist perspective of the system, the best user experience possible in that scenario is still the BIP 70 stuff. But the primary issue is how wallets handle that. I just handed out an IOU. What do I do with it now? So those are all of the things to think about in the specification stuff. And there are a couple guys at BitPay that put together a JSON payment protocol specification, which handles some of that, which really handles that well. So it'd probably just be good to talk to them. I don't even know what the latest issues are likely, but it would be very good if the Bitcoin Cash community standardized on something that didn't use protobuf, did not require X509, ideally used some authenticity spec for Bitcoin. I would push BitAuth, and required and had some good guidance for how wallets handle that IOU issue.
Well, that's a good summary. Maybe add on a few things in my experience with it. I've implemented this in that neutrino wallet that's still in beta for, I don't know, a few months ago, 6 months ago, maybe. And yeah, I mean, some of the stuff that you mentioned is issue. I will say, I think JavaScript in general is like, it's like the most annoying language to work with. So in Go, downloading and validating a X509 certificate was only about 160 lines of code, and it just makes use of the standard library. So it was like 15 minutes to implement. So like, I mean, I think it's a matter of what tools you have available in terms of like how difficult this is for you. Maybe there are things we can do to like ease the pain of doing stuff like that in JavaScript. I think part of the impetus for protobuf versus a JSON is that protobuf serializes real nicely for signing, whereas JSON, you have to start like defining a canonical ordering of everything in order so that people can construct the JSON object and for signing, and it's kind of more annoying to sign JSON objects than it is protobuf in that sense. And that's not saying that you shouldn't do it, but there's like other considerations there. One of the issues we talked at in Australia about the I know like Bitcoin.com was doing something to try and give a better like merchant name, to like when you're paying, and it'll say, do you want to pay? And it gives like the merchant name. And so they were doing, I think they were just doing like a lookup through their system or something like this, like an API query, which is probably okay, but I mean, you prefer not to have like a centralized API that you have to query to do these name lookups. But I think with the X509 certificates, see, what I'm doing is using the common name in the certificate as what is displayed. Now, there's positives and negatives to that. So like the first is like, if you're paying BitPay, it's only going to show you're paying BitPay, right? So it's not going to say you're paying, whatever the pizza place is that you're using. You're only going to see, do you want to pay BitPay, which is a little UX wise, it's not as great. And it's also going to say, do you want to pay bitpay.com, because the common name is always like a .com or whatever your URL is, or your domain name is. So that's also a little weird in the sense that like the CAs are validating this as like a web URL, but we're not using it as a web thing. So when we display the name, it looks like you're paying to a website. Now, if we allowed like another field in the payment request where it had like the merchant name, this wouldn't be authenticated. So there would be some concern that you could go out, get yourself a valid certificate, and then just like put, like Amazon.com in there, and then it'll show the user like, do you want to pay Amazon.com? And you're like, oh, you got the nice green check mark, and it looks like it's authenticated, but it obviously it would just be, not authenticated. So I don't know if that, allowing a separate name field in there that's unauthenticated seems like it could be an avenue for people to do some funny business. So I'm not sure what the best way of doing it is. Like I said, I'm just using the common name in the field. I don't know if anyone else has any better ideas there. And then there's also I haven't looked into the BitPay JSON protocol recently, but like it seemed to me like they were using like GPG in a way that just didn't seem like it was going to be viable to me. Like you had to like you had to hard code the certs that you wanted and that sort of stuff, or do some kind of web of trust type thing. But it's basically on the user to get the certificates and validate them manually, rather than like the X509 thing is validated by the CAs. But anyway, those are just my thoughts.
Yeah, and I would agree with you also on the GPG thing. It's not something I think is a good idea long term, and would be good. One element for why it would be a good idea for Bitcoin Cash to have a stronger spec that we talk about a little bit and document well.
Yeah. That's great. Anybody else want to weigh in on this?
I have a interesting thought that is not practical in the short term, but in the optimistic medium or long term. Basically what, I don't know how many people saw our presentation in Australia for the double identity thing, but all of those signatures are just the SCCP2V6K1 signature. And one of the type of entities that can be registered are businesses. So it is plausible that like BitPay could actually register with like a Dublin notary. And then they could actually reach out to them and actually have that kind of like basically Bitcoin address notarized from them. It's not perfect still because, you know, the user would be like dependent upon trusting Dublin as a notary, or, you know, whichever, it doesn't have to be Dublin, obviously, whatever state or entity they choose to trust, because in that federated network. But you know, that could be a longer term future. So I don't know, we'll see. But that's all I kind of wanted to add. It could hopefully be cooler in the future. For now, it still is what it is, though.
Isn't that just making another basically CA system? Like,
yeah.
Effective. Okay.
Yeah, effectively. It's basically, I mean, like we in our proposal, we literally spent like a page and a half explaining how the internet basically notarizes itself. We were like, this is exactly the same thing as a certificate of authority when you go to a website. It's just now it's for people, and
yeah,
it's mining spec.
I'd point out that the original, when Bit70 was introduced, Mike Hearn spent a good amount of time, like essentially suggesting that there could be like Bitcoin-related CAs that validate people's identities, and that would work right with the existing X509 system. You would just need to, the wallets would just need to like add that as a CA basically, but then they could do validation that the normal CAs don't, where normal CAs are like geared towards like websites, whereas this could be geared more towards companies or Bitcoin addresses and that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be great if there's probably a lot of discussion like that for, that would be good for a group of a few developers to really put down in writing. There's a few other things with like using the X509 thing. For example, there are also only a few cases where when you get a payment protocol request, you aren't already pulling it over HTTPS, and so it's already using the web request library's SSL validation when it pulls the request, and then the protocol standard requires the wallet software to check it again. And so the SSL check is actually being done twice in a lot of cases already. So there's things like that that are just strangeness.
Yeah. I mean, if you actually think about it, I mean, there's only really two scenarios where you would get a payment request. One is you're in person, and you could get it like through if you could embed the whole thing in like a QR code or something, like you're not even pulling it down over the internet. And then the other one would be over the internet, but if you just use the HTTPS connection, then it's okay. I guess the only real reason I could see wanting to have like a separate signature was if like people were forwarding requests for other people and that sort of stuff, but
yeah.
All right. I see that there will be lots of room for further discussions on BIP70, and that clarity that you guys brought up was really good. I wanted to move on to the discussion of the upgrade coming in November. I wonder who would like to take the lead on this one with regard to progress.
Can I just say one more thing about BIP70? Sorry, before we move on.
Okay.
I mean, basically what I was hoping to do was that someone would kind of start a work group or somehow like lead to further stuff going on about this. So I guess my question is like, maybe I should just start a work group and start inviting a bunch of people. Because there's a bunch of people that aren't here also, like the Electron Cash developers and so on. Do you guys think like Jason, I guess, and Chris would you be up for joining a work group like that?
Yeah, I mean, you need to get like the BitPay people and like
Yeah.
people who are using it really heavily to join, because if it's just something that we implement and then
Yeah.
don't tell them about, like, or just say, hey, by the way, we're all doing this, and they didn't have any contribution, then
Yeah. Well, I mean, at a minimum, we'd want, definitely like BitPay, Bitcoin.com, wallet people, and electronic cash, I guess, are the three that spring to my mind. And like as a kind of modest objective, just getting a specification that actually is accurate in terms of what's implemented right now would be a good thing to have. And then beyond that, there could be I guess there's lots of room for improvement beyond that also.
That would
Okay,
be
maybe I'll try to make that happen then.
good. And Antony, I'm sure you understand you don't need permission to do that, and it would be cherished by the people here if you would go ahead and start that. I'm sure.
Yeah, I was hoping someone else would do it, but
All right.
maybe I'll lead
Get the
the
ball.
way. I don't know much about it. That's my thing. I just see that it's something that could be useful.
We've got a couple of other people that are involved with BitPay that I'm sure would be willing to help out, so they're just not able to make it today. But thank you, Antony. Any further comment on BIP 70 before I try and move on to the upgrade?
Yeah. Antony, I'll help you bear that burden if, so long as it's yours to bear.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Jason. Can I get somebody to start the conversation about the upgrade? Maybe bring us up to date on where you're at. Mark, you've got your hand up and your mic's muted.
Sure. Yeah, I'll just describe what the upgrade is. We had Schnorr signatures we added in May in the last upgrade. And it wasn't a quite complete edition. We didn't add the Schnorr signatures to all of the cryptographic opcodes. What we left out was opcheck multisig, which is used for multi-signature addresses for the most part, 2 of 3, that sort of thing. So in November, we're going to sort of take off the final box and just add Schnorr signatures to that opcode as well. So you can use Schnorr signatures in any of the script opcodes in Bitcoin. And a second upgrade happening in November is malleability reduction, which is called minimal data. So it'll just mean that when you perform pushes of things in a script, you have to do it in a certain canonical way. And that is sort of like the last of many, many malleability reduction fixes that have been done over the last basically 2 years. And yeah, so those are basically the 2 new features coming in November. And they are implemented in Bitcoin ABC as of 0.20, so 0.20.1, 0.20.2 also are compatible. I don't think any of the other nodes have done it yet. I guess I'll let you guys take that away.
Maybe we could shift over to Andrea Suisani. I know that he had mentioned that he might have some information on their upgrade.
Yeah, quickly, just wanted to say that Bitcoin Unlimited have just tested these 2 new features and was able to get sync on the testnet that we are using. That imaginary username is as set up to test the new features, the new feature that we are going to deploy in the November protocol upgrades, and we were able to sync successfully and also mine blocks on top of the chain tip. So the next PU release that will be 1.7, and that will be out next week, in the beginning of next week, will be ready for the next upgrade.
That's great, Andrea. Thank you. Anybody have any questions to Andrea regarding their upgrade?
You're welcome.
Oh, okay.
Just to make sure, you guys did synchronize to the correct testnet chain tip, because I think last time there were some people mentioned they tried to join the testnet. They did it too late or something.
Yeah, well, we use the parameters that were shared in the ABC Slack in the test channel, and we checked that before mining blocks on top of it, we tested that the Explorer, the imaginary username, setup was on the same chain tape, same hash, same block, same transaction. So I guess that we managed to sync on the correct testnet, but as soon as we release, we are going to have an official test contacting imaginary username so that we can start again from scratch and be sure that everything is okay.
Awesome.
Great. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah, I haven't seen any or much discussion in the testing work group about that. But yeah, if you guys wanted to like do it.
Yeah, we just wanted to make sure that we have working code before bothering you with setting up a new round of tests. So just wanted to share that we managed to sync to the already forked testnet, and then we are going to ask you to ask imaginary username to set up a new round of tests to be sure that we actually have the right code. Great.
Any other implementation want to give an update on their readiness for November 15th? Maybe that's the wrong question.
I feel like it was a pointed question to me, so I'll answer it though.
It wasn't. I mean, the fact that we have somebody that will answer it tells me it wasn't in Maine. So go for it.
No, it's fine. So we reviewed everything. It actually looks pretty good. We reviewed it before even in Australia. We haven't actually implemented it yet. We've been working on some SPV stuff, but we're not terribly concerned. It's a fairly small upgrade from our perspective. In fact, I think we've actually have upgraded a large portion of it, just haven't enabled it. But you know, a lot of that has to do with like testing and stuff. So we definitely have some work to do, but I'm not stressed about it at all. So I expect to make the deadline.
You're pretty confident.
Yeah, same thing in BCHD. I've got other work stuff that's going to consume me for a little while, but I don't anticipate it taking a long time to do these changes. Someone else is also, of course, free to help out with that too if you want.
It is a small upgrade. Smaller than the last one, I would say. Even.
That's great. So the two elephants in the room have been identified and spoken, so that's good. Thank you for that. Any other further discussion on the upgrade for November 15th? Hearing none, we're getting close to 1 hour into this. I don't see any questions from the attendees. We have a couple of attendees, but no questions. Is there any panelist that has any items that they would like to bring forward for discussion, or any blatant advertisement work being done? I wasn't looking at anybody in particular.
I can talk about SPV stuff real quick. I'll keep it really short. I am actively investigating and brainstorming some ideas to make SPV a little bit better than it is. It's a pretty low bar. The one thing that we're actually looking at is actually making like solving the problem of is anybody serving us a Merkle block that omits one of our transactions? That could happen from either a bug or someone being malicious. We're trying to come up with some creative ways to solve that. If you're interested in that discussion, I can either create a separate work group, or we can just use the Bitcoin Verde work group in Telegram or anything else. So that's all.
That's great, Jason, or Josh. Thank you for that. Anyone else have anything they would like to put forward for final discussion before we end the meeting? Hearing none. Oh,
I'll just say one small note, which is it's not too early to start thinking about the next May upgrade.
Great, Mark. Thank you for that.
If anyone has anything, you don't have to say it now, but yeah.
Sure. Is there a temporary wish list for the following upgrade in May?
I will be a squeaky wheel, and I forget what bit number it is, but it's the one where basically bloom filters are committed to blocks when they're mined or something along those lines. Mark, do you know which bit that is?
Talking about 157, 158, I think.
Probably. That sounds about right.
Those aren't Bloom filters. They're like Golem. What are they called? Golem rice filters or something. But
Yeah, something. They were something, but it was basically just a way for people to actually like know that the Bloom filter they'd be getting for a block is legit for SPV stuff. I'm basically like part of that discussion that I was talking about. Like that's one of the like the small history on that is I came up with a very similar idea, and then when I posted that in the XT, they were like, "You should check out this BIP," and I'm like, "Oh, this is basically a better version of what I just thought about." So I don't know what discussion has been had around those BIPs and what how people feel about them, or if they just never got any attention. But that might be a really good place to start.
Well, that is implemented in BCHD, Josh, both of them, with some slight
Awesome.
modifications.
Check it out. Okay.
Yeah. So
yeah, I'd be happy to hear about what those modifications are.
Well, basically, it's possible for you to download the block and the filter and see if the person who gave you the filter lied and gave you the wrong filter, right? You just deterministically build the filter. But Greg Maxwell proposed a change. I have no idea why, really, but like to change how the filter was constructed so that you can't deterministically build the filter. And so it broke that ability to like, keep the other, check to see who gave you a bad filter. And so they went ahead and ran with that idea because Greg proposed it in BTC, and I more or less just reverted it and went back to the original idea because it was better that way.
Yeah, I agree with your judgment. So yeah, I think if we go that route, I actually the one thing that I was looking when I was looking into those bits, I just found it very. Like it's very well done in many cases, but it's also kind of like overkill. Like it does a lot of stuff. And I don't know like what the benefits for why it does a lot of things. Like there's probably a more simplistic way to go about it. I'm not sure if the reason why they weren't adopted in BCH is just because the implementation cost is kind of high. So those are the kinds of things that I would love feedback from, like reasons why people would be against it.
Yeah, very new.
I don't know if oh, what's that?
It's very new. It's not even implemented on Bitcoin Core yet. So,
I don't know if the implementation cost on the server is very high, but on the client side, it's very high. So, I mean, I can tell you, like, if we probably wouldn't be having a Neutrino wallet if these other guys didn't write the code, because it's very, very complex client code, and I'm almost relying. It's basically the Lightning Labs people who wrote the client code. And I'm more or less relying on their code almost 100%, like 98%. I've made a few changes, but it's very complicated code that I wouldn't want to have to write myself.
Yeah, and it's not really a replacement for SPV, like proper normal SPV either. Well, I would say the Electrum style of SPV is honestly much better than the BIP37 thing that the Bitcoin Core came up with. But it's either way, it's much lighter than what you get with the Neutrino BIP 157, 158 type. I don't know if you could even call it SPV. It's more of just a block tagging filtering system where you have to end up downloading a full block if you want to find your transaction within it. So it's much heavier than just normal SPV.
Oh yeah, is that? I mean, I don't want to. I don't know how long we want these meetings to be, but yeah, that wasn't my understanding of the BIP as I read it actually. So maybe I'm maybe I'm confusing them, or maybe I just misunderstood it, or maybe you're talking about something different. Because yeah, downloading the full block would be like if you do one transaction every 10 minutes, cool. Like you just downloaded the whole blockchain. So that obviously doesn't work. Yeah, so that wasn't my understanding of that bit. So I don't know, like I said, if you were talking about something different, or if I misunderstood something, or if it's just a different bit altogether. I have no idea.
Yeah, that's basically how it works. When you do these sort of compression, like Bloom filters and these Golem filters, they're kind of similar. But basically, you can get a situation where you can know that you have something that you're interested in the block, but the filter doesn't tell you where it is within the block, and it's also not going to tell you how many of the the items that you're interested in are in the block. So you don't know that whether it's just 1 or 2 or 3. And so as soon as you realize that there's at least one item you're interested in, you have to download the full block, because you have to find out, okay, how many were there actually in the end.
Yeah, the count that's literally one of the hacky ways that we're trying to solve things now is we have some custom Bitcoin Verde messages floating around, and it's like, this is the Merkle block, and then also these are the number of items that you should expect when you request it. But that you're relying on a node and doing some other stuff, and it's not, it's still just more of the same kind of problem. So yeah, anyway, those are the kinds of things that I want to be talking about in somewhere, maybe the Bitcoin Verde Telegram, I don't know.
Okay, if you want to pop up the link to that, Josh, that would be great, or give it to me and I'll make sure it gets out to everyone. I'm not sure everyone has access to it right now.
Yeah, let's do that, because I have no idea how to do it. I've used Telegram for like 6 months, so I still don't really know how that works. So yeah, I'll get you the link and then we can both share it out.
All right, sounds good. Any further discussion on any items at all?
For next hard fork, or maybe in the one after it, I'd love to be involved in any UTXO commitment discussion. I don't know if anybody's working on that currently, or if there's a Telegram group for it. I think it's been quiet for a while, but is anybody on here working on it? Cool.
Is there a hand from Mark on that one? No? Okay.
No. Cool.
Seeing a show of hands.
All I know is there's a little bit of like an analysis paralysis type thing going on right now, because of so many different ways to do the UTXO commitments, and there's like, they have different capabilities. If you just want to do fast sync, then there's some like really good ways to do that. But if you want to like a UTXO commitment that you can make an SPV proof inside, or something like a Merkle proof inside, then you might need a Merkle tree, or maybe there's some more fancy cryptographic method, but maybe it's slow. So there's all these sort of like design questions of what is the UTXO commitment actually for? And that's, until those are answered, I don't think it's really going to go anywhere in terms of practical implementations.
Great. I do have a link from Josh, and Jason, if you have a link for anything you want to add to the show notes on this, once the video is produced, by all means, and we'll make sure they get out to the group in the Telegram, via Telegram. So. Nice. Any other further items to be discussed at this point? We've done a fairly decent job of cramming an hour and a bit with some good solid information. So I want to thank you all for that. If there's nothing further, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all very much for attending.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Yep.